Name a human society, anywhere, at any time. Almost every one of them has a substance. Something chewed, brewed, smoked, sniffed, or swallowed that changes how the day feels. We did the fermented ones in the episode on alcohol, so set those aside. This is about the plants, and about a fact that sounds like a joke until you sit with it. Almost every one of them is a poison. Nicotine, caffeine, morphine, cocaine, atropine, mescaline. None of these compounds exist to make an animal feel anything pleasant. A plant cannot run and it cannot hide, so it fights with chemistry. Those molecules are insecticides. They are there to paralyze a caterpillar or to make a grazing animal sick enough that it learns to eat something else. So the interesting question about drugs in prehistory is not when. It is why any animal would deliberately seek out a plant's defense system over and over for thousands of years. Hold that, because the answer at the end of this episode is genuinely strange. First, the harder problem, which is proving any of it happened at all. A leaf rots. Smoke goes up the chimney of a cave and is gone forever. Somebody chewing something on a hillside 40,000 years ago leaves nothing whatsoever. So this whole field runs on 4 kinds of evidence, and it is worth knowing which one you're being shown. The first is the plant itself, when it survives by accident. Charred seeds in a hearth. Dried capsules in a dry cave. The second is residue. Alkaloids soak into porous things and stay there, so a pipe, a cup, or a jar can be tested for what passed through it. The third is the body. Traces end up in dental calculus, in hair, and in preserved feces. The fourth is the equipment. Snuff trays, tubes, mortars, spatulas, a kit shaped for one job and no other. And there's a trap under all of it, which is that finding a plant is not the same as finding a use. Poppy seeds are food. Hemp is rope and cloth. A coca leaf in a settlement proves that a leaf arrived and nothing else. The good cases are the ones where the plant, the container, the chemistry, and the context all point the same way. And the chemistry has to be policed because alkaloids move. They leach through soil, and a modern hand or a modern lab can put them there. So a serious residue study runs blanks, tests the surrounding sediment, and reports what it failed to find as well as what it found. Start with the oldest claim, which is also the plainest. In the Great Salt Lake Desert in Utah, at a place called the Wishbone site, there is a hearth from about 12,300 years ago. In the ash, a team led by Darren Duke found 4 charred seeds of wild tobacco. Tobacco has almost no food value. Its seeds are tiny, and nobody is eating them for calories in a hunting camp, which puts a wild tobacco plant deliberately brought to a fire about 9,000 years before anybody domesticated it. It is 4 seeds, and the authors are careful about that. Seeds can arrive in a fire by accident, in bedding, or in the guts of an animal. But the site has no other reason to contain the plant, and the alternative explanations are worse than the simple one. Then the technology arrives, and the evidence gets much harder to argue with. Pipes are porous, and nicotine soaks into the clay and the stone and stays there. Residue analysis has now pulled nicotine out of pipes and pottery from sites across North America, in some cases 3,000 years old and more. That is not a plant that might have been used. That is the chemical in the object and the layer. Staying in North America, there's an older case that needs no inference at all because it comes out of a dry cave. In the Shumla caves in southwest Texas, small dried buttons of peyote cactus were found, trimmed, and strung. They were radiocarbon dated to around 5,700 years ago and then tested. The mescaline was still in them, not a residue and not a seed. The drug itself, intact, older than the pyramids. Moved to the other side of the world for a habit almost nobody in Europe thinks about, and which is used by hundreds of millions of people today. Betel. You wrap a slice of erica nut with slaked lime in a leaf and chew it. It is a stimulant, and it stains the teeth a deep red. In Duyong Cave in Palawan, in the Philippines, a burial from around 4,000 years ago has exactly that staining on the teeth. The person is buried with shell adzes and shell beads, and their teeth carry the mark of a daily habit, which is a nice reminder that a habit can be written on the body itself. Caffeine leaves the same kind of trail, and it produced one of the neatest results in the field. At Cahokia, the great city near modern St. Louis, distinctive tall beakers from about 1,000 years ago were tested by Patricia Crown and colleagues. They carry the signature of a strong caffeinated drink, brewed from the leaves of Yupon holly, which does not grow anywhere near Cahokia. The nearest source is several hundred kilometers away on the Gulf Coast. So the cup tells you two things at once: what people were drinking and how far somebody had to go to supply it. Now, Opium, and a site this series has already been to, in the Cave of the Bats in southern Spain, which we met in the episode on carrying things for its esparto grass baskets. One of those baskets held poppy capsules. Around 6,000 years old, in a cave used for burial, with the capsules deliberately bagged. For a long time, that was the strongest case in Europe, and it was still, technically, a plant in a bag. Then in 2022, chemistry closed the gap. At Tel Yehud, in Israel, in Canaanite burials from the 14th century before the Common Era, small juglets of a very distinctive shape were tested. The shape is the giveaway. Upside down, the vessels look like a poppy capsule, and people had noticed that for decades. The residues came back positive for opium. The container was advertising its contents, and the contents were in the container, in a grave. Now cannabis, which for years was all rope and no smoke. Hemp fiber is ancient and boring. The plant is grown for cord and cloth across Eurasia for thousands of years, and none of that tells you anybody was inhaling it. The case that changed it comes from the Pamirs Mountains of western China, at a cemetery called Drzhenkel, about 2,500 years old, 3,000 meters up. Graves there contained wooden braziers holding burnt stones. A team led by Emin Yang and Robert Spengler analyzed the residue on those stones. They found cannabinol, the breakdown product of THC, at levels well above what the wild plants of the region normally carry. So somebody was heating stones, piling high-potency cannabis on them, and filling an enclosed space with smoke at a funeral. And there is a footnote that historians enjoy. Herodotus described the Scythians doing almost exactly this, sitting inside a tent with heated stones and hemp seed, howling with pleasure. For 2,500 years, that was treated as a traveler's tall tale. The braziers suggest he was reporting. Which brings us to the single best object in this entire subject. In a rock shelter in southwestern Bolivia called Cueva del Chileno, at 4,000 meters, a bundle was found in a grave. It is about 1,000 years old, and it is somebody's kit. A leather bag made from 3 fox snouts sewn together. Inside it, a carved wooden snuffing tube, a snuff tablet, 2 spatulas, a headband, and pouches. In 2019, a team led by Melanie Miller ran the residues through mass spectrometry. The bag tested positive for cocaine and benzoylecgonine from coca, and bufotenine, and harmine, and dimethyltryptamine, which is usually shortened to DMT. That is at least 3 separate plants from at least 3 different environments in one bag. And 2 of those names together are the interesting part. DMT taken by mouth does essentially nothing because an enzyme in your gut destroys it before it reaches the brain. Harmine blocks that enzyme. Combine the 2, and the DMT survives the journey. That combination is the pharmacological basis of ayahuasca, and it is not obvious. There is no reason to expect that mixing 2 inert-looking plants produces an effect neither has alone. Somebody 1,000 years ago was carrying both in the same bag at 4,000 meters. And they had come a long way. Coca does not grow at that altitude, nor do the other ingredients. So the bag is also a map of a supply network, which is exactly the kind of thing we tracked in the episode on trade. Now the newest kind of evidence, which reads the person rather than the pot. At Carritx, a cave on Menorca in the western Mediterranean, funerary chambers held wooden tubes with painted lids. Inside the tubes were strands of human hair, dyed red, cut from people who were buried there about 3,000 years ago. Hair is a recorder. As it grows, whatever is circulating in the blood gets locked into the shaft month by month. In 2023, Elisa Garadoce and colleagues tested those strands. They came back positive for atropine and scopolamine, which come from nightshades, and for ephedrine, which is a stimulant. This is a different order of proof. Not a plant near a person, not a chemical in a cup, a drug inside a named individual over a period of months. And the same trick works elsewhere. Dental calculus traps, micro-remains, and chemistry against the tooth, which we used in the episode on food. Preserved feces do the same job further down, which is how the parasite record got built in the episode on disease. So the picture we now have is not a scatter of hints. It is a set of specific people with specific compounds in their tissue. Then the obvious question, what was any of it for? And here you have to be careful, because the sample is skewed in an interesting direction. Almost every case in this episode comes from a grave, a burial cave, or a ritual bundle. Partly that is real. Partly it is because those are the places where organic things survive and where objects are deliberately deposited. A man chewing coca on a path leaves nothing. The same man buried with his kit leaves an archive. With that warning, the ethnographic record is fairly consistent about the uses. Healing and the diagnosis of illness, divination and contact with the dead, endurance for long work, suppressing hunger, cold, and pain, and binding a group together in a shared experience. What is largely missing is our own main category, which is recreation, and the sharp line we draw between a medicine, a food, and a drug. Coca chewed with lime on a mountainside is closer to a work tool than a party. Tobacco offered to a spirit is closer to a prayer than a habit. Those categories are ours. They're not a fact about the plants. Which brings us back to the question from the beginning and to the twist. Why would evolution leave us wide open to a class of molecules that plants invented specifically to poison animals? The usual answer is that these compounds hijack a reward system that evolved for something else, and that we are simply being fooled. Roger Sullivan and Edward Hagen have argued that this explanation is too comfortable, and they call the problem the drug-reward paradox. An organism strongly attracted to neurotoxins should be at a serious disadvantage. That attraction should have been selected away, and it was not. So they asked a different question. Not what do these chemicals do to us, but what are they actually good at? And nicotine is very good at one thing in particular. It paralyses worms. Nicotine and related plant alkaloids are effective anthelmintics. Some of them were used as livestock dewormers well into the 20th century. In the episode on disease, we said that before the modern world, essentially everybody carried intestinal parasites, and the coprolite record shows it plainly. So the hypothesis is this. A person who chews or smokes a mild plant toxin regularly is dosing their own gut. And there's a field test of exactly that. Casey Roulette and colleagues worked with AKA foragers in the Central African Republic, where tobacco use is common among men. They measured nicotine metabolites and hookworm loads in the same people. The men with more nicotine in them carried fewer worms, and the effect tracked the chemistry rather than just the label of being a smoker, which suggests the appetite is not a design flaw. It may be an old and rather clumsy piece of pharmacology. Now, the caveats, because this is a hypothesis and not a settled result. It works best for nicotine and for compounds with a clear antiparasitic action. It does not explain everything. Caffeine and the hallucinogens do not fit neatly, and plenty of researchers think the hijack explanation is still doing most of the work. And a mild dose of a mild plant, chewed, is not what we are talking about today, which is where this joins the ending of the alcohol episode. There we finished on distillation. Yeast cannot survive its own waste past about 16%. So for 10,000 years that was the ceiling, until somebody learned to concentrate it. Every plant here has had the same thing done to it. A leaf you chew for hours becomes a white powder. A poppy capsule becomes an injectable. A pipe becomes a cigarette, engineered to deliver a dose to the brain in about 10 seconds. The plant sets a dose. The plant also sets a speed because chewing takes time and a leaf runs out. Those two limits are not moral facts. They are just properties of a leaf, and they held for a very long time. Purification removes both limits at once, and the appetite that survived 100,000 years of leaves meets a delivery system a few hundred years old. So the oldest thing in this story is not the pleasure, and it is not the ritual, and it is certainly not the escape. The oldest thing in it is the dose.